The sterile air of the alien medical bay hummed softly with the sound of advanced diagnostic machines. Ethan, a human diplomat representing Earth, sat awkwardly on a sleek examination table, his surroundings bathed in a soft, pulsating blue glow. Across from him stood Narae, the alien nurse assigned to his case. She was from a species called the Azyrelians, tall, with translucent skin that shimmered like liquid crystal, her large, opalescent eyes studying him intently. While she was undeniably alien, her form was humanoid enough to be unsettlingly attractive to Ethan. Her voice, soft yet commanding, carried an almost hypnotic cadence as she instructed him to remove his shirt for the preliminary scans. Ethan complied, his movements hesitant. As his shirt came off, Narae's gaze lingered on his chest. "Your musculature is denser than most Xyrelians," she observed clinically, though there was a curious lilt to her tone. Ethan chuckled nervously, unsure whether to take that as a compliment or a scientific observation. "Well, we humans are built for endurance," he quipped, trying to mask his unease with humor. Narae tilted her head, her crystalline features catching the light. "Endurance. Fascinating. We will test that soon," she said, her voice calm but laced with a hint of something Ethan couldn't quite place. The examination began in earnest. Narae waved a cylindrical device over him, its tip emitting a soft beam of green light that scanned his body. The device occasionally emitted a series of rhythmic beeps, each sound prompting her to jot down notes on a hovering holographic screen. Ethan couldn't help but notice how closely she stood during the process, her presence both clinical and oddly intimate. "Now," she said, her gaze locking onto his, "we proceed to examine the lower regions. Please disrobe entirely." Ethan froze, his face flushing. "Wait, you mean?" Everything he stammered. Narae nodded, her expression unchanging. "Of course. To understand your physiology, I must inspect all components, especially the reproductive apparatus. Is that not standard in your medical practices?" Ethan laughed nervously, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. Not usually with this level of scrutiny," he muttered. Narae seemed puzzled by his hesitation. "Is there an issue? Are you ashamed of your instrument?" she asked, her head tilting in genuine curiosity. Ethan nearly choked. "Instrument? That's not. I mean, we don't usually call it that," he said, his voice trailing off. Narae's confusion deepened. "But it is the term in your medical files. Your species categorizes it as a multifunctional biological tool. Please reveal it so I may evaluate its structure and capacity." Ethan blinked, unsure whether to laugh or bolt from the room. Resigning himself to the absurdity of the situation, Ethan began to undo his belt. He tried to maintain some semblance of dignity as he removed his trousers, standing awkwardly in his boxers. Narae's gaze remained fixed, her focus unflinching. "Is there another layer? Please proceed," she urged, her tone still professional. Ethan groaned inwardly, muttering something about cultural differences, before finally lowering his boxers. The cool air of the medical bay only heightened his discomfort as he stood exposed before the alien nurse. Narae's eyes widened slightly, and she leaned forward, her face mere inches from him. Ethan felt his face turn a deep shade of red. "Fascinating," she murmured, her voice carrying an almost reverent tone. "The structure is so dynamic. It appears capable of both rigidity and flexibility. This duality is rare among the species we've studied." Ethan cleared his throat, his voice cracking. "Yeah, well, humans are full of surprises," he said, attempting to inject some levity into the increasingly awkward situation. Narae ignored his comment, her focus unwavering as she took detailed notes. Then, to Ethan's horror, she reached out with a slender, glimmering hand. "May I?" she asked, her tone polite but insistent. Ethan's eyes widened. "May you?" what he blurted out, though he already knew the answer. "Examine it more closely," she said simply. "I must assess its responsiveness and functionality." Ethan took a step back, his hands instinctively covering himself. "Responsive? Functional? Lady, it's not a piece of lab equipment," he exclaimed. Narae raised an elegant brow. "Is it not? Its design suggests otherwise. It appears highly specialized, capable of fluid transfer, pressure modulation, and interspecies compatibility. Such complexity demands thorough analysis." Ethan groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. This is not how I imagined my first alien encounter going, he muttered under his breath. Narae waited patiently, her unblinking gaze fixed on him. Eventually, Ethan sighed. Fine, but can we at least call it something less? Mechanical Narae considered this for a moment. What would you prefer? Rod. Lever. Extension unit, she offered, each suggestion making Ethan cringe further. Just call it by its proper name, all right, he said, exasperated. Narae nodded solemnly. Very well. I shall examine your penis. The clinical nature of her tone did little to ease Ethan's embarrassment as Narae resumed her examination. Her touch was light but deliberate, her hands cool against his skin. Your vascular system is intriguing, she remarked, her fingers tracing the network of veins. The engorgement mechanism is highly efficient, allowing rapid transitions between states. This must be advantageous for reproductive activities, Ethan coughed, his voice strained. Yeah, it's pretty useful. Can we maybe not discuss this in so much detail? Narae ignored his discomfort, her fascination evident as she continued her analysis. Your sensitivity levels are unusually high, she noted, her tone still clinical. Is this a common trait among human males? Ethan groaned, his face buried in his hands. I wouldn't know. I don't go around comparing notes, he muttered. Narae's head tilted again, her expression curious. Perhaps you should. Comparative data could enhance our understanding of interspecies compatibility. Ethan let out a strangled laugh. Yeah, I'll get right on that. As the examination dragged on, Ethan found himself torn between mortification and a strange sense of amusement. The absurdity of the situation was impossible to ignore. Here he was, stark naked in an alien medical bay, having his most private anatomy scrutinized like a science project. And yet, despite his embarrassment, he couldn't deny a certain admiration for Narae's unwavering professionalism. She treated the situation with the same detached curiosity she might have applied to any other subject, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Finally, Narae stepped back, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. The examination is complete, she announced, her voice calm and measured. Ethan let out a sigh of relief, hastily grabbing his clothes and beginning to dress. Great. So, what's the verdict? Am I healthy, he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Narae nodded. Your physiology is remarkably robust. Your instrument is in excellent condition, exhibiting optimal functionality and adaptability. You should be proud of its capabilities. But Ethan paused mid-button, unsure whether to laugh or be offended. Thanks. I guess he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Narae offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. You are most welcome. Should you require further examinations, do not hesitate to contact me. Your anatomy offers valuable insights into the unique attributes of humanity, Ethan chuckled, shaking his head as he finished dressing. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Next time, though, maybe we can start with something a little less personal. Narae inclined her head. As you wish. Though I find this interaction most enlightening. As Ethan prepared to leave the medical bay, he couldn't help but glance back at Narae. Her crystalline features caught the light, her expression serene yet inscrutable. Despite the bizarre nature of their interaction, there was something oddly endearing about her unflinching curiosity. Ethan smiled to himself, shaking his head. Well, he muttered under his breath, at least it'll make one hell of a story. Ethan stepped into the hallway outside the medical bay, still trying to process what had just happened. He couldn't decide whether the situation had been a violation of personal space or a bizarrely flattering display of alien curiosity. As he leaned against the cool metal wall, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Narae emerging from the bay, her serene expression unchanged. She approached him with the same clinical grace she had maintained throughout the examination. Ethan, she said, her voice soft yet firm. I require additional data. Your physiology, while fascinating, raises questions I cannot answer with observation alone. Ethan raised a brow, his instincts warning him this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Questions? Like what, he asked, half afraid of the answer. Narae's luminous eyes fixed on his. Your files indicate that your species engages in physical bonding rituals to test compatibility. I wish to understand this process more intimately, she said without hesitation. Ethan nearly choked. Wait, what? Bonding rituals, you mean? You're talking about sex? His voice cracked on the last word, his mind reeling at the bluntness of her request. correct," Narae replied, as though discussing a scientific experiment. "My analysis of your reproductive capabilities is incomplete without practical demonstration. Do you consent to participate?" Ethan's jaw dropped. This was definitely not in the diplomatic training manual. Consent? "Lady, that's not how humans just, go about things." He rubbed the back of his neck, his face flushing. "There's usually emotions, context, at least dinner first." Narae tilted her head, her translucent skin shimmering under the corridor's lighting. "Dinner? Fascinating. Is food consumption a prerequisite for copulation among your kind?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious. Ethan groaned, realizing he'd walked right into that one. "No, it's not. Look, it's about building trust and connection. You don't just jump into something so, intimate." Narae stepped closer, her crystalline form radiating an almost otherworldly allure. "Your perspective is enlightening," she said, her voice softer now. "Yet, I must stress the importance of this research. Understanding human bonding rituals could have significant implications for interspecies relations." She paused, her gaze dropping slightly. "If trust is required, then perhaps we can establish it. Would that suffice?" Ethan found himself at a loss for words. The sheer audacity of the situation, combined with Narae's unflinching sincerity, left him torn between laughter and disbelief. "You don't really give up, do you?" he muttered, shaking his head. Narae's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a gesture that made her seem almost human. "Persistence is a valued trait among my kind," she replied. "Now, if this trust-building process involves food, I suggest we begin. I have studied your dietary preferences and prepared a meal in anticipation of further interaction." Ethan blinked. You planned for this?" he asked, incredulous. "Of course," Narae said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Data suggests that shared experiences enhance interpersonal bonds. Food consumption appears to be a primary method among humans. Shall we proceed to the dining chamber?" Before Ethan could respond, Narae had already started walking down the corridor, her shimmering form leading the way. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is not how I imagined my day going," he muttered, reluctantly following her. The dining chamber was small but elegantly designed, with a circular table in the center surrounded by sleek, cushioned chairs. Narae gestured for Ethan to sit, and he complied, still trying to wrap his head around the situation. On the table were plates of food that looked surprisingly appetizing, considering they'd been prepared by an alien species. There were colorful fruits, steaming bowls of what smelled like soup, and a loaf of bread that glistened with a strange, iridescent sheen. "This is impressive," Ethan admitted, eyeing the spread. "You really did your homework." Narae inclined her head. "I synthesized these dishes based on your cultural preferences. Please consume as much as you require. It is vital that you are nourished for the next phase of our interaction." Ethan nearly spat out the water he'd just sipped. "The next phase," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Of course," Narae said calmly, taking a seat across from him. "Once trust is established through this shared meal, we can proceed with the bonding ritual. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated, Ethan." Ethan's face turned a deeper shade of red. "You really have a one-track mind, don't you?" he muttered, picking up a piece of the shimmering bread and taking a tentative bite. To his surprise, it was delicious, with a flavor that reminded him of honey and cinnamon. As they ate, Narae watched him intently, her expression thoughtful. "You exhibit signs of discomfort," she observed. "Is my presence causing you distress?" Ethan sighed, setting down his fork. "It's not you, Narae. It's just this whole situation is a little overwhelming. Humans aren't used to being this open with strangers, you know." Narae nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "I see. Your emotional barriers are more complex than I anticipated. Perhaps I have been too direct in my approach." Ethan chuckled, despite himself. "Yeah, you could say that." For a moment there was silence as they both ate, the tension in the room slowly easing. Narae seemed to be studying him in a different way now, her gaze less clinical and more curious. "Ethan," she said after a while, her voice quieter, "I wish to understand more about your emotions. You speak of trust and connection, yet these concepts are foreign to my kind. Can you explain what they mean to you?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, considering her question. Well, he began, trust is about feeling safe with someone, knowing they won't hurt you or take advantage of you. And connection. That's about sharing something deeper, feeling understood. It's not just physical, it's emotional. Narae tilted her head, her shimmering skin catching the light. Fascinating, she murmured. Such concepts are absent from our culture. We operate on logic and practicality, yet I find your perspective intriguing. Ethan smiled faintly. Well, maybe we're not so different. You seem pretty curious about us, and curiosity is the first step to understanding. Narae's lips curved into another small smile. Perhaps you are correct, she said. Thank you for sharing this insight, Ethan. It is enlightening. The rest of the meal passed in relative peace, the tension between them replaced by a strange sense of camaraderie. Ethan found himself relaxing, his initial discomfort giving way to genuine curiosity about Narae and her species. By the time they finished eating, he felt a surprising sense of ease in her presence. Well, he said, standing up and stretching. That was not what I expected, but I'll admit it wasn't bad. Narae rose as well, her luminous eyes meeting his. I am pleased to hear that, she said. Shall we proceed to the next phase? Ethan froze, his brief moment of relaxation shattered. Next phase. Narae's expression was perfectly serene. The bonding ritual. Now that trust has been established, it is time to further our connection. Ethan groaned, rubbing his temples. You're not going to let this go, are you? Narae stepped closer, her crystalline form shimmering with an almost hypnotic glow. Persistence is a valued trait, is it not, she said, her voice soft yet unwavering. Ethan sighed, his mind racing. Okay, fine. But can we take it slow? Maybe start with, I don't know, a handshake. Narae tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. A handshake? Fascinating. Show me how it's done. As Ethan reached out his hand, Narae studied it with the same intense curiosity she had shown during the examination. Her glowing eyes flicked between his fingers, analyzing every contour. When she finally extended her own hand, her touch was unexpectedly cool and smooth, her translucent skin radiating a faint, otherworldly warmth beneath its surface. Ethan chuckled nervously, their hands still clasped. It's just a handshake, Narae, not a fusion experiment. Narae tilted her head, clearly pondering his words. Fascinating. This gesture appears to symbolize mutual respect and the initiation of trust. Yet I detect tension in your musculature and an elevated heart rate. Are you experiencing distress? Ethan blinked, pulling his hand back. No distress. Just, you're standing kind of close again, he said, gesturing awkwardly to the minuscule space between them. Narae didn't step back. Instead, she studied his reaction with a slight narrowing of her eyes. Your species values proximity in some contexts, yet avoids it in others. This inconsistency intrigues me. What is the significance of distance? Ethan sighed, realizing there was no simple way to explain human nuance to someone so literal. It's not about the distance, exactly. It's about comfort. Personal space varies depending on how well you know someone or the kind of interaction you're having. She leaned in even closer, her eyes gleaming like twin galaxies. How do we determine the appropriate level of proximity for this bonding ritual, she asked, her tone utterly serious. Ethan's breath caught as he found himself practically backed against the wall. Narae, you're really, committed to this, he stammered, his mind racing for a way to slow things down. Commitment is essential to effective research, she replied smoothly, her crystalline form shimmering as though reflecting his unease. I must explore all parameters thoroughly. If proximity facilitates bonding, I shall adjust accordingly. Before he could respond, she reached out and lightly touched his shoulder. The sensation was oddly electric, a mix of coolness and warmth that sent a shiver down his spine. You are trembling, she observed, tilting her head. Is this a sign of readiness? Ethan sputtered, his face flushing crimson. No, it's not readiness. It's just you caught me off guard. Narae stepped back slightly, though her piercing gaze never wavered. Very well. I shall recalibrate my approach. Perhaps verbal interaction will ease your discomfort, she paused, her lips pursed in thought. You previously mentioned that emotions play a significant role in human bonding. Are there specific phrases or expressions that elicit these emotions? Ethan let out a short laugh, running a hand through his hair. You mean like flirting, compliments? Flirting, Narae repeated, her tone neutral yet curious. Explain this concept. Ethan groaned, realizing he'd once again opened a can of worms. It's like playful or suggestive comments to show interest in someone, but it's supposed to be subtle, not clinical. Show me, Narae said immediately, her gaze fixed on him like a predator analyzing prey. Ethan hesitated, feeling the weight of her unrelenting curiosity. All right, but don't take this the wrong way. Okay, he cleared his throat, then looked at her with a half smile. You know, Narae, you've got these eyes that could make anyone lose track of time. It's like staring into infinity. Narae blinked, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Ethan wondered if he'd gone too far. But then her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Your comment is both poetic and effective. I experience a unique resonance in response. She paused, her gaze narrowing. Does this sensation indicate that I am bonded to you? Ethan laughed nervously, shaking his head. No, that's just appreciation. Flirting doesn't mean bonding. It's more like laying the groundwork. Narae seemed to process this, her crystalline form shimmering subtly. Fascinating. I shall attempt this method. She stepped forward again, her luminous eyes locking onto his. Ethan, your dermal pigmentation change, what you call blushing, is aesthetically pleasing. It highlights your vulnerability, which I find compelling. Ethan stared at her, caught between amusement and disbelief. Thanks, he said, scratching the back of his neck. You've got the directness down, that's for sure. Narae studied him for a moment longer before tilting her head. Was my attempt successful? Have I flirted effectively? Ethan couldn't help but laugh, shaking his head. You're getting there. It's a bit intense, but hey, practice makes perfect. She nodded, her expression serious. Understood. If practice is required, I shall continue. Ethan froze, realizing he'd inadvertently signed himself up for more of Narae's unique brand of interaction. Maybe we could focus on something else for now, he suggested, desperate to shift gears. Narae raised an eyebrow, a surprisingly human gesture, such as... Ethan hesitated, then gestured toward the control panel on the wall. Why don't we talk about something less personal, like the ship? What kind of tech are you guys working with here? Narae glanced at the panel, her expression softening. An acceptable diversion. Follow me. She led him down the corridor to a room filled with glowing consoles and intricate machinery. As she began explaining the ship's advanced systems, Ethan felt himself relax. The conversation shifted to a more comfortable dynamic, with Narae's intense focus directed at technology rather than his anatomy. But even as they talked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of her research. Every now and then, she would glance at him, her gaze lingering a moment too long. And though she seemed engrossed in her technical explanations, there was an undercurrent of curiosity that hadn't dissipated. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what she had in store for him next. For now, though, he was content to keep things as professional as possible, at least until her persistence inevitably brought them back to more complicated territory. Narae's voice broke into his thoughts. Ethan, your expressions suggest you are distracted. Are you formulating a question? Ethan shook his head quickly. Nope, just taking it all in. This is some impressive tech you've got here. She nodded, though her gaze remained sharp. You are avoiding the topic of bonding. Is this due to discomfort or reluctance? Ethan groaned inwardly, realizing there was no escaping her relentless curiosity. Let's just say it's complicated, okay? Humans don't just dive into things like this. Complication breeds understanding, Narae replied. I am willing to navigate this complexity with you. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. You really don't give up, do you? Persistence, she said simply, her faint smile returning. Shall we continue? Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head as he leaned against the console. You know, Narae, humans aren't as straightforward as you think, he said, meeting her curious gaze. Sometimes we need time to process all this. Narae tilted her head, her crystalline features softening. Time, then. I shall grant it. but my curiosity remains infinite." Ethan smiled, a mix of relief and amusement. "Fair enough. Let's take it slow." As they stood there, the vastness of space stretched beyond the viewport. Narae's persistence lingered, but for now the tension eased. There was time, plenty of it, to figure things out. Ethan chuckled, extending his hand. "Baby steps, Narae. Baby steps."